Katie Boyer is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's at-risk species coordinator for Texas and Oklahoma. She works with partners to proactively conserve species that are at risk at a landscape scale. She also co-leads the service's National Pollinator Partnership Program. And she'll be talking to you folks today about monarchs and pollinator conservation. Please take it away, Katie.
Sure, thank you, John. And that was a great segue there. You can see my screen, right, John?
Yes, you're
all
good to go.
Perfect, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I have been working on monarch conservation since 2015 and just moved into this new role of at-risk species coordination, specifically for Texas and Oklahoma. But I am instrumental in our region, which includes Arizona and New Mexico, trying to think through how we can get ahead of future listing decisions. So this is a great opportunity to talk to you all specifically about monarchs and that kind of at-risk work. In addition, so today I'm going to cover a quick overview of monarch biology and then key information from our species status assessment as it relates to the listing decision for the monarch and where we're at in that Endangered Species Act process. And lastly, I'll go over what's probably the most important piece of all of this, which is how you can get engaged in monarch and pollinator conservation moving forward. So to start, why are pollinators important? And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but somewhere between 75 and 95% of all flowering plants need our animal pollinators. This includes our small plants, shrubs, vines, wild fruit trees. Without our pollinators, these plants could not produce seeds and fruit and would eventually disappear. In addition, loads of other organisms depend on these plants for food and shelter and would eventually disappear as well without our pollinators' contribution. Some plants today are also in danger of becoming extinct because they lack sufficient pollinators. Some plants and their animal pollinators develop such close evolutionary relationships that one cannot survive without the other. Some pollinators, for example, have really highly specialized mouth parts specifically for feeding on a particular plant. And if that plant disappears, the pollinator cannot shift to another plant. If the pollinator disappears, then no other pollinator has the unique structures that can feed on that plant and subsequently pollinate the plant. So they are vital to our ecosystems. Pollinators are also critical to our food supply since most of our food comes from our flowering plants. Animal pollinators are responsible for bringing us 1 of every 3 bites of food that we eat. And this includes much of our fruits and vegetables, chocolate, coffee, nuts, and spices. Most of these are what gives our diet variety and flavor and are some of our favorites for sure. So because of their contribution to the food supply, pollinators also have a huge economic value. About 8% of global crop production directly relies on pollinators. A recent report that was done by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services estimates that the annual value of global crops affected by pollination is over $235 billion. Honeybees alone are responsible for $1.2 to $5.4 billion in agricultural productivity in the US alone. So we have pollinators to thank for the diversity and abundance of foods that we eat. They are responsible for producing more than 180,000 different plant species and over 1,200 crops. In addition to the food that we eat, pollination provides loads of ecosystem services that support the health of plants, people, and the planet. For example, they improve biodiversity by facilitating that plant reproduction and providing food and shelter for birds and mammals and other insects. The roots of pollinated plants also bind to the soil and rock particles, helping hold the soil together and reducing erosion. Additionally, as pollinated plants die and decay, this organic matter provides nutrients for the next generation and improves our soil health. So these are just some of the ecosystem services that pollinators provide, which were featured in the 2020 Pollinator Partnership poster that you see here, which I think is just a beautiful summary of all of the great things that our pollinators do for us. And of course, monarch butterflies are just one example of a pollinator, but that's the focus of my talk today. And I also want to tell you how they kind of became the poster child for pollinator conservation in recent years. So I can't do that without starting with a little bit about their basic biology. Monarchs go through a complete metamorphosis, which takes about a month to complete this life cycle. It includes 4 stages. It starts with the egg that you see here. The very first thing that the monarch caterpillar will do when it comes out of its egg about 5 days after that egg has been laid is eat the egg casing. And then that larva or caterpillar will just chow down on milkweed. And they eat and grow rapidly over the course of about 2 weeks that they're in that caterpillar phase. Milkweed is their host plant and the only plant that they can eat during that phase of their life. During this time, they grow 2,000 times their original mass in about 2 weeks, which is the equivalent of a human infant growing to the size of an adult elephant in 2 weeks. They then will find a safe place, likely just a few meters away from the milkweed plant that's fed them, and they will spin a silk button with the spinneret, which is located beneath their mandibles, and then hang upside down from their abdomen to shed their skin one last time before they create their chrysalis. So they'll hang upside down in a J shape like you see here for almost 24 hours, and then they shed that skin that last time very rapidly. And you can see that signature green and gold chrysalis or pupa here. 10 to 14 days after pupation, you'll start to see the signature orange and black coloration of the adult monarch showing through that transparent casing. This is the very last thing that develops in the pupa stage, right before the monarch is getting ready to eclose. It takes only about 30 to 60 seconds for the monarch to open that casing and make its way out, like you see here. When it first comes out, it looks kind of deformed and clumped together. It will actually hang upside down and pump its abdomen to release liquid into the wings to make them expand to their full size. It'll hang there for 4 to 6 hours to let the wings dry and harden, and it's still very fragile for about 24 to 48 hours after this, but they can fly as soon as those wings have hardened. So in compiling information to conduct the species status assessment for the monarch, we found monarch occurrence records in 90 countries, islands, or island groups. However, there's really no reliable records of monarchs outside of continental North America or the Caribbean before 1840. It's generally accepted that monarchs and milkweed dispersed from North America via human assistance, potentially aided through wind dispersal events. So things like hurricanes, for example. The SSA assumes that monarchs have been naturalized in these locations and they include the historical range. That said, the pie chart that you see here illustrates the current estimated proportion of individual monarchs by geographical area based on the data we have right now. As you can see, this green area is showing monarchs of the eastern migratory population that occurs here in North America. The SSA cites roughly 77 million monarchs in eastern North America based on the average of the last 5 years of overwintering estimates, assuming a density of about 21 million monarchs per hectare. The tiny purple sliver that you can barely see there is Western North America. The SSA documented about 168,000 monarchs in this population based on the average of the past 5 years of overwintering counts at the time of the SSA, but I'll tell you in a minute how that's changed. The overwintering count for this population dropped significantly last year. In Australia, researchers estimate about 1.4 million monarchs, and we do not have any standardized population estimates for monarchs outside of Australia and North America, but experts estimate approximately 4 million. So what that should tell you is the vast majority of the global population of monarchs really occurs in North America. Generally speaking, there's two populations of migratory monarchs in the US, and they're separated by the Rocky Mountains. Monarchs that occur in eastern Colorado and New Mexico, for example, are likely part of that eastern migratory population, though that isn't always the rule. The eastern population spends its winters in the high elevation Oyamel fir forests down in Mexico in the states of Michoacan and state of Mexico. Each spring they migrate northward, they seek out their mates, and they lay their eggs on milkweed plants. The adults die off, the eggs go through complete metamorphosis, a new generation is created, and they continue flying northward, seeking milkweed upon which to lay their eggs. There's generally 4 or 5 generations each annual cycle. And in the fall, when the days start to get shorter and temperatures start to get cooler, the monarchs then start flying southward to return to their overwintering grounds in Mexico. Monarchs on the west side of the Rockies are part of the western migratory population. They have historically spent their winters at about 400 sites of native Monterey pine and Monterey cypress trees or non-native eucalyptus trees along 620 miles of the California coastline. Small groups of overwintering monarchs inland have also been reported in parts of California and in Arizona as well. Each spring, they fan out across the west to lay their eggs on milkweed and drink nectar from flowering plants throughout Arizona, California, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Utah. They're generally following the riparian areas and canyons throughout the west during those summer months. Recent studies show that that continental divide is not like a hard separation between the two populations. There have been monarchs that were tagged in Arizona that overwintered in Mexico and vice versa. So they're also not different genetically. So they are admixing throughout that area. When they're not overwintering, the monarchs find their habitat in areas that have the milkweed necessary for their caterpillars and nectar plants necessary for food for the adult butterflies. Fortunately for them and for us, this can come in habitat of all types and shapes and sizes and locations. When it comes to conserving at-risk species, it's really rare that we have an opportunity to encourage habitat all over the place, whether it's in a back patio garden, on your property, on acres and acres of rangeland, in a schoolyard, along a right-of-way, on an urban park, in a golf course. The moral of the story with monarchs is really, if you build it, they will come. Additionally, in creating habitat for monarchs, there's a whole lot of other species that are likely to benefit. So those milkweed plants that the monarch caterpillars rely on, when I'm out in the field looking at them, there's often loads of other insects that are drinking nectar from them or crawling on them all over the place. So it's pretty amazing to see. But what's good for monarchs is often good for loads of other pollinators and native ecosystems as a whole. So while monarchs occur all over the world, about 90% of their global population is in North America, and both the East and the West populations have declined. The Eastern monarch population size is estimated by measuring the area that the monarchs occupy when they're clustered together in really high densities down in Mexico. This population has been systematically censused since 1994, and the results are what you see through this graph. So of note, in 1996 to 1997, there were about 45 acres occupied down in Mexico, and they hit their all-time low in 2013 to 2014 when only 1.65 acres were occupied there. That spurred an international movement to help bring back the monarchs, so to speak. We've had a few years of up and down since then. Of note, in 2018 to 2019, we had just under 15 acres occupied. our goal for conservation of monarchs is to hit 15 acres as the average population estimate for a 5-year average. So we hit it 1 year, we need to be seeing numbers above that for a few years to accommodate for these dips that you see since then. This past winter, they occupied about 5 acres of forest in Mexico, which was a 26% decrease from last year. So in the West, as I mentioned, the monarchs migrate to the coast of California each winter. And for this population, the size is estimated through a massive volunteer effort in which individuals count monarchs along the West Coast over a 3-week period called the Western Monarch Thanksgiving Count. This is led by the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and this is their graph that you see here. The estimated Western population was at least 4.5 million monarchs in the 80s, and 1.2 million as recently as 1997, like you see on the left side of this graph. For the last 3 years, the overwintering population estimate was less than 30,000 butterflies. This past year's estimate was 1,914 butterflies, so 1,914 butterflies. This is less than 0.01% of the historic size of this population. Obviously, this is a severe decline. The blue line is showing the increase in survey effort that has occurred since then. And really, this is showing us we need immediate action to reverse this trend and recover monarchs in the West. This is a different way to show that same story put out by the Xerces Society. Just enough, since many of you are in the range of the Western monarch population, I think it's worth showing this really powerful visual as to how few monarchs really seem to be out there. So the species status assessment looked at the current status of the monarch and the primary drivers that are causing that are influencing their current and future conditions. And that included stressors and then also conservation efforts. The key stressors are loss of milkweed and nectar sources, loss and degradation of overwintering habitat, both in Mexico for the eastern population and in California for the western, exposure to insecticides, and then climate change. The final SSA report outlines these influences on future conditions of monarchs and describes future outcomes based on millions of simulations that we had experts run using a wide range of these influences. The SSA report indicates that in the monarch's current condition, the probability that the eastern population will reach the point that extinction is inevitable in less than 10% over the next 10 years. So that's for the east. The western population has a much higher probability, 60 to 68%, of reaching that point due to the current threats over the next 10 years. We found that that probability climbs when projected over the next 30 years, varying from 24 to 46% for the eastern population and up to 92 to 95% for the western population. So at the current and projected population levels, both the eastern and western populations become more vulnerable to catastrophic events as well, like extreme storms or widespread drought over future years. So part of the reason why we prepared the species status assessment is a result of the petition process. We originally received a petition to list the monarch butterfly as threatened with a 4D rule in August of 2014. And on December 31st of that year, we made an initial 90-day finding that stated the petition is substantial, meaning it contains enough information that we need to do a 12-month status review. So over the course of 2016 to 2020, we were working on that status assessment. On December 15th of 2020, we announced a 12-month finding on that original petition to list the monarch. Based on the thorough review of the species status, we determined that listing is warranted, but a proposal to list the monarch is precluded at this time while we work on higher priority listing actions. This means the monarch becomes a candidate species It's added to the National Listing Work Plan. And based on our listing priorities and workload, the service intends to list the Monarch in fiscal year 2024 if listing remains warranted at that time. Because it is now a candidate species, we will review its status every year to ensure that priority is appropriate. There's currently listing actions for 161 different species that are higher priority than the Monarch. This is in part due to the tremendous amount of conservation going on for the Monarch, but we really need to ramp that up, especially in the West where we've seen these really dramatic declines. If we want to get to a point where listing is not warranted, it's going to take a lot more effort moving forward. There's been a lot of different kind of pivotal moments in pollinator conservation over the years that I've worked on monarchs. The first being the North American Leaders Summit in 2014, in which the former president of the US, former president of Mexico, and Prime Minister of Canada all got together, and of all things they could talk about, they started talking about monarchs and agreed to establish a working group to ensure the conservation of the monarch butterfly, a species that symbolizes our association. Responding to that plight, later that year, former President Obama released the presidential memo on pollinators and followed it up with the federal pollinator health strategy in 2015. These documents really set forth 4 themes of our work that have carried forward since then. Those include conducting research to understand and prevent and recover pollinator losses, expanding public education programs and outreach, increasing and improving pollinator habitat, and then developing public-private partnerships across all of these activities. So since we originally received that petition to list the monarch, loads of conservation efforts have gained momentum. It's the efforts of folks like all of you who are here banding together to create habitat and contribute to research that are really helping us save the monarch. So in order to help us assess the status of the species, we created the Monarch Conservation Database to get a better sense of all of these ongoing and planned actions for monarch conservation. This is the primary tool we use to gauge the magnitude of the completed, implemented, and planned conservation efforts since that petition to list the species in 2014. The figures that you see here represent the totals as of December 2020 when we released that 12-month finding. As you can see, over 5.6 million acres of habitat have been created out there or are planned for creation, which is just tremendous. How you can help moving forward, you can help by creating habitat, and that essentially means planting the native milkweed plants and the nectar plants that feed the adult butterflies that really bloom throughout the growing season. And depending on where you are, that's really going to vary. But it's really important to focus on those native plants as well. And you can also incorporate best management practices on the lands that you manage. There's loads of good information out there about how to do that. And then lastly, we hope you will engage in community science efforts, which can help us track the migration, monitor monarch health, and better understand monarch habitat attributes and stressors. This is especially important, I think, in the Western United States where we have so few monarchs. So if you do see a monarch, it's critical that that information is documented. In the West, the Xerces Society has released a very specific call to action because of that really low number of monarchs this past year. The 5 key steps to recovering the Western monarch population in the short term include protecting the overwintering sites along the California coastline, really working to stop destruction of habitat, which has been lost due to things like urbanization. And then restoring that breeding and migratory habitat in California throughout the Coast Range, Central Valley, and the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, which these areas are really where the first generation of monarchs is created each year. And they really need spring blooming native nectar plants and milkweed in order for that to continue. Third is to protect monarchs and their habitat from pesticides. seek alternative treatments to get rid of invasive species, or apply integrated pest management. And then fourth is protect, manage, and restore summer breeding and fall migration habitat outside of California as well. So if you have existing monarch habitat, manage it in a way that is going to minimize harm. And then also restore natural habitat and plant pollinator gardens, of course. And then lastly is answer key research questions. It's especially important to collect observations of monarchs and milkweed in the early spring in California and Arizona, and throughout the West over the course of the summer as well. I would encourage you to check out the website here for more information about this call to action. So I have a couple slides I'm going to breeze over, but I'll make sure you are sent a PDF of this. There's loads of resources out there that can help you create habitat. These are just some of them. No need to write them all down. And then when you're creating pollinator gardens, it's important to have high diversity of your plants, plant in clumps with a variety of colors and shapes, eliminate pesticide use, and of course, choose native plants. When it comes to restoring habitat, we're talking about removing invasive species, removing brush, implementing prescribed fire, and then adding native seeds that historically would have occurred there to the reseeding mix, collecting seeds and propagating those so you can use them for reseeding in the future as well, or planting plugs, but always it's important to think about irrigation when you're doing this. Monarch Community Science, there's loads of different programs you can engage in if you're interested in getting involved in monitoring of monarchs. Again, you can check these out when the PDF is sent to you if you are interested. And then moving forward, we as the Fish and Wildlife Service are really using what we've been able to achieve with monarchs with the help of so many partners as a framework for us to broaden our scope and look at pollinator conservation at large. So there's a lot of success stories about the monarch despite the continuing declines, and we really want to build off of those where we've learned things that have worked. So this is our vision moving forward and our mission. I am the co-lead for our National Pollinator Partnerships team, and if you're interested in getting involved and partnering with us on pollinator projects, please do reach out to me because I would love to work with you. And with that, I'm going to put up my contact information since I'm out of time. I can sure talk, but please contact me. My information is here.
Thank you, Katie. And based on the number of folks who have joined us, I think this is a very a topic of a lot of interest. And so I'm going to open up the floor now for questions.
I got the chat open. I don't see any there.
Any questions from anyone?
I have a question.
Please.
Yes. I'm sorry if this information isn't correct, but a while ago I read like a article about there being monarchs having a very similar type of other butterfly too, and I was just wondering if there was other butterflies like that where it's like they're similar but don't have the same like I guess qualities that the monarchs have.
Sure, yeah, there are a lot of different butterflies that look like monarchs. For example, one that I see all the time here, I'm in Austin, Texas, is the queen butterfly. And they host on milkweed plants just like the monarch. They're orange, black, and white like a monarch. And it's hard to tell them apart unless you really know what you're looking for. They're different in that they don't migrate. So you'll see them in the same areas that you see monarchs, but monarchs are the longest insect migration in North America. So especially the monarchs that migrate down to Mexico in this eastern migratory population, they're really unique in that behavior. But then also in the West, this migration pattern that they have there is really unique as well. But queens are just one example. There's also viceroys, painted ladies, like lots of different butterflies that do look a lot like monarchs and occur in the same type of habitat as they do.
I see. Okay. And I also wanted to ask if I guess if you do see like a monarch around, and if you wanted to call it in, like, does it really kind of like matter or too much if it actually is a monarch, or as you say, a queen?
Yeah, it would be great if you can catch it in enough time to take a photo. That's excellent thing to do. Because then someone else can can make that identification for you. But if you do see a monarch out there, Journey North is the primary community science group that you'd want to report that to. And it's really easy to do that, even with like an iPhone photo, and just create your account and upload that sighting. And if you think it's a monarch and you didn't get a photo, I would still encourage you to go ahead and put that data in the Journey North website.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sure. I saw a chat come through in the chat here, which is, what's the stance on captive rearing of monarchs? So we, as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, don't regulate rearing of monarch butterflies. I will say that I personally am not a huge fan of captive rearing of butterflies unless it is done for education purposes and uses native habitat for that. So for example, a teacher who has created a monarch garden and attracts butterflies to lay their eggs on native milkweed in that garden, and then brings a caterpillar inside to the classroom to teach the children about that, I think that's a really valuable thing to do. But there are a lot of hobbyists out there who are well-intentioned, but are captive rearing those butterflies in really large quantities. And that can pose other risks with parasites and disease and just other issues as well. So that would be what I have to say about captive rearing of monarchs. I would caution against it unless it's for that educational purpose.
We are over, but we've still got like 20 folks who are hanging on. Does anyone else have any other questions? Please feel free to ask away, because I know Katie is super interested in answering questions.
I appreciate all of you hanging on late too. I'm never at a loss for words when it comes to talking about monarchs.
Katie, I just have to ask if you could talk a little bit about the tag that you're showing on the screen.
Sure.
That was something that surprised me, putting a tag on a butterfly. But I did it once and it wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, I was nervous, but it went on easily and the butterfly seemed to be unaffected and flew off.
Yeah. Tagging of monarch butterflies is a really fun way to engage in research about them. So the tags have a 6-digit code on them. And if you go out and net a butterfly or a monarch and tag it, you then enter that 6-digit code and information about that monarch into a database. And then the Monarch goes on about its business, and researchers in Mexico actually go out at the overwintering grounds and look for tagged butterflies. And if they find them, they can go into that database and tell where those monarchs came from because of the data you entered associated with that 6-digit code on the tag. So in the Eastern US, Monarch Watch is the primary entity that leads this program out of the University of Kansas. And in the West, the Southwest Monarch Study is doing loads of work on this. And that's actually a group out of Arizona, especially because we know we have some monarchs overwintering in Arizona. So if you're in that state, it's a great way to get engaged and really kind of critical information to help us understand what's going on with the monarch. And the tags don't seem to hurt the monarchs or anything like that. And it's pretty easy and fun to put them on them.
And how can people get tags?
Through Monarch Watch or the Southwest Monarch Study. So they both have websites you can find very easily, and they'll send you tags with specific codes for you to use.
Here's a question on chat. Do monarchs show up on migratory trackers like Birdcast? I don't know what that is.
I don't know. Okay, I thought for a second, I don't know what Birdcast is. I do know monarchs have showed up when they're migrating in really big densities on like weather radars and things. So if Birdcast is anything like that, I would imagine the answer is it could be. Birdcast is a tracker of avian migration. Huh.
I am not familiar with that. I can't help you out on that, Katie.
That's all right. I'm curious if Birdcast uses like geo trackers from or anything like that, or if it's just able to see concentrations of migrating birds. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Now I have something to look into. Thank you for that.
Yeah, me too. I'm curious. Birdcast. Well, we're starting to drop. The participants have declined by 25%. So I think we're moving to finishing up. But I think if anyone has a question that they've been holding off on, Katie, I think is interested in answering it. Well, I think hearing no more questions, we will draw this presentation as well as the T&E session to a close. I got a thanks, Vicki. Excited to look into that.
That was from me because she sent the link to us.
Interesting presentation. Thanks, Katie. Excellent talk. Yeah, that was very, very informative, Katie. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, everyone. Well, I guess we'll reconvene tomorrow morning.